It seems like everyone is reeling from the shock that Donald Trump won re-election here in the United States today. And that's going to be the focus, at least from an enterprise IT perspective, here on the Gestalt IT Rundown. We're also going to be talking about a login bug at Okta, nuclear Amazon data centers, approved, denied, or maybe what the new administration thinks of those. Microsoft recalling recall again, Cloudera's private link, Google Cloud platform with MFA, and the financial woes of Supermicro. Tune in now for the Gestalt IT Rundown. Welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown, where each time we meet, we run down the IT news of the week with a variable degree of snarkiness. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, and joining me today, since Tom is out at Networking Field Day, is my co-host, Jack Poller. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be here today.
Well, it's great to have you. It's not like there's any news in the world today, so I figure we can focus on the tech news. I'm just kidding. It's Election Day aftermath day, and I want to start off by pointing out that it's also National Stress Awareness Day. I think that regardless of your views and regardless, frankly, of your location, it seems like the U.S. election has been causing a lot of stress. So be aware of that and be aware of what that can do for you and the ways that it can damage you. And if stress eating is your thing, I will also point out that today is National Nachos Day.
Yeah, well, I think, as you mentioned, a lot of us are feeling a lot less stressful today than we were last night. And it's great to get on to the real world of the technology news rather than the political news.
Yep, but it all affects everyone. So let's start off with our stories of the week. Okta recently disclosed a security vulnerability that allowed users to log in without a correct password under specific conditions. And what could be wrong with that, right? Okta has since fixed the issue by updating its cryptographic algorithm and advises affected customers to review access logs from the past 3 months, just in case somebody logged in without the correct password.
So, this is good news and bad news. The bad news for Okta is they've gotten hit by yet another issue. In the past couple of years, they've been plagued by this, by login and access issues, and that's their one job, is to get this right. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news is there were very specific conditions here that needed to be met. So it's highly unlikely that this particular issue was exploited. Let's start with, you had to have a very long username. It had to be 52 characters or longer, which is really, really long and unusual. The second is you had to have previously logged in and had that login cached on your device. The third is you had to not be using two-factor authentication. And the fourth, and the most important part, is this had to be part of an Active Directory integration. So it's not just a straight login, but part of Active Directory. And those Active Directory servers had to be down or very busy. So there was essentially a timeout and a retry on the authentication attempt. So it was very unusual sort of corner case conditions that led you down this path, where you could then get logged in without actually supplying the correct password. So that's the good news. I think the better news is that most organizations that are involved in this type of configuration, where they're talking to Active Directory, are actually now enforcing two-factor authentication. So again, it makes it a very weird corner case. But it's bad in general to have an environment open for 3 months where you can log in without a password. Once again, I'll sort of say that my guidance is, if you're a CISO or security professional and you're not making MFA mandatory for your environment, you really should find another job. Back on October 2nd, Tom and I talked about nuclear power for AI data centers and how that's now becoming a thing. Unfortunately, Amazon's plans to power new U.S. data centers with nuclear energy faced a setback after the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission rejected an agreement allowing it to draw additional power from the Susquehanna nuclear power plant. Despite the chairman, Willie Phillips, advocating for approval, the Regulatory Commission ruled the proposal lacked sufficient support, raising concerns over preferential treatment and the potential effects of similar arrangements on the grid in future cases.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic and one that I've been talking about here, as you mentioned, we've all been talking about here on the Rundown, as well as on the TechStrong Gang, which I appear on Tuesdays. Uh, the question is, how are we going to power this AI future? And nuclear is one way to do that. Of course, this also has implications for these companies' promises to go carbon neutral, which they have been, let's say, overlooking in the rush to deploy more and more GPUs and AI infrastructure to compete with each other in that space. So essentially, the companies looked around and said, "What can we do to power this all this AI equipment that we're buying?" Well, nuclear seems to be a good idea, but is it? As I pointed out on Techstrong Gang recently, the rates that they're paying for nuclear power are actually not that great. It's fairly expensive energy, and also the fact that they have to invest so much to restart these plants or expand these plants or build new data centers and so on makes it not as great of a deal as you might think. But of course, the nice thing about nuclear is that it does generate a lot of electricity with very little carbon output in terms of global warming. So all of these things have come together to lead basically every one of these companies to try to build a data center next to a nuclear plant and try to lease a great deal of energy from that plant at a, well, reasonable rate. Unfortunately, it looks like two of these are now derailed. As you mentioned, the one here with Amazon has been, well, I guess torpedoed for now by the FERC, who are saying that no, it doesn't make sense because of the other uses of this Susquehanna nuclear plant that they were intending to connect to. In another story, we see that Meta's plans for a nuclear powered AI data center have also been scuppered, as they say, this time because of the discovery of endangered bees in the space that they were supposed to be building their data center. Um, so far, the surprising one is that Microsoft's idea to restart 3 Mile Island has not been rejected. But, hey, time will tell. But as we're going to talk about on the closer look, things may change here now that we have a new administration coming in Washington, and that administration may be more friendly to businesses and less friendly to environmental regulations. So we shall see what happens long term with these nuclear powered data centers and whether it makes sense to pursue them or not under a new administration. Microsoft has once again delayed the release of its AI recall feature for Copilot Plus PCs, pushing the preview for Windows Insiders to December. Recall that Recall was originally slated for an October release and has been plagued by concerns about security and privacy implications. The delays stem from Microsoft's efforts to address these concerns by making Recall an opt-in feature that can be fully uninstalled and theoretically fixing other ways that the feature can be exploited to expose private data. The company remains committed to delivering a secure and trusted experience with Recall. At least that's what they say. Jack, what do you think about this secure and trusted experience?
Well, there's actually two stories here. I think the first is the issue with security and trust, which is first and foremost. And I'm really glad to see that Microsoft is putting in the effort to get it right. When they made the original announcement, all of us in the security and the privacy community sort of raised our hands and said, what's going on here? This can't possibly be the case where you're going to record everything a user has done and put it in an unprotected database that anybody with access to the internet can get access to. And it just made no sense whatsoever. So it's great to see that Microsoft is actually putting in the time and effort to protect this feature and protect the user's data and protect our privacy and our security. The fact that it's taking this long is also a testament to how hard it is to get it right. And, again, like I said, it's great to see that Microsoft is making that effort to get it right. The other story, or the story under the story, is that the PC market in general has been relatively stagnant for quite a while. There was actually a big bump in PC purchases, laptops, during COVID, when everybody moved from working in the office to working from home and needed home machines. And then the market itself has been relatively flat. The ability to add AI, starting with this recall feature and Copilot Plus, leveraging built-in AI co-processors, was seen as a big push to reinvigorate the PC market and drive corporations to buy new PCs and new laptops rather than sticking with 5, 6, 7-year-old machines. And a big part of that was going to be a availability before December, before the Christmas buying rush in the United States, both at the corporate level and at the personal level, for people buying laptops for themselves, for kids going to college, Christmas gifts, etc. Now, with this being pushed out, that bump isn't going to happen, and it may never happen at the rate that Microsoft is going. So it's going to be interesting, not only for Microsoft, but what's going to happen to the PC makers and the PC market in general.
Cloudera recently launched the Cloudera Private Link Network, a service designed to provide secure internet-free connectivity across multi-cloud environments. This network allows data to travel securely between customer workloads and Cloudera's control plane without traversing the public internet, addressing privacy and regulatory concerns for industries like finance, healthcare, and pharma. By using services like AWS Private Link and Azure Private Link, the Private Link network enables consistent security across cloud providers, reducing the complexity of cross-cloud setups and lowering the costs by simplifying network management. But for more on this story, let's turn to Mitch Ashley from the Futurum Group, who's studied the issue in detail.
Yeah, interesting news from Cloudera, Stephen, right, regarding their private link network. Now, this is kind of plumbing stuff, right? Because Cloudera is a data intelligence, data lakehouse, data aggregation business. They're not in the network business, but of course, when you're operating in the cloud and you're moving data around, not just within one cloud, but across multiple clouds, then what kind of link are you going over, and is that link secure? And this gives you a way of making sure that as data is being brought in from between AWS and Azure, and I assume someday they'll probably have Google, but for now it's those two clouds. You're doing it in a secure manner, so you can check off the box and make sure that you're compliant with protecting the data, both that it's not going anywhere that it shouldn't between those two clouds, and also that it's secure, it's been encrypted, etc. And you have a way of managing that. I think a couple other notable things about it is, one is, it sounds like it's pretty easy to set up. There's a command line interface and kind of self-service. It doesn't take a lot to configure it, which is not unusual for cloud services. So I would, you would hopefully expect that. It's good to see. Again, especially if the data engineering, the data teams are working with their IT organization to get this provision with their cloud teams. So the lower the friction, the faster folks will implement it. So I would imagine this will help Cloudera in terms of continue to grow business and work with customers in more heavily regulated industries. Financial services, of course, there often is a mix there of what's in the cloud, what's on-prem, or possibly in multi-cloud, as well as, of course, healthcare. And you can kind of think of the typical players. I think the other thing that was notable about this to me is so many times companies, enterprises end up in multi-cloud by force, not by choice, because they acquire companies, they acquire subsidiaries, whatever it might be. They're in a different cloud. So suddenly now you've got to secure that intercommunications between clouds. Sort of a heads up thinking about this. This seems like a pretty natural service the cloud providers might offer themselves. So I could easily see them becoming competitive. There are other alternatives. It also gets to be a little bit confusing about, what about CASB and the interconnection between SaaS applications, and does that go over this link? Or using API calls to get into whatever the SaaS application is to export data? And is that part of a CASB managed security application, or is that done over this private link network, or both? So there may be some crossover, maybe duplication there. We'll have to see. But all in all, makes very much sense why they made this move, and I don't think it drives them too far into the security business and away from their data platform business, which is all good stuff. Back to you.
Thanks a lot for that, Mitch. It's great to have your perspective here on the rundown, and I look forward to seeing you again on the TechStrong Gang. In response to rising cyber threats and high profile data breaches, Google has announced that it will require all Google Cloud users to enable multi factor authentication by 2025. Starting this month, users will receive reminders to implement MFA with mandatory enforcement beginning in the new year. This policy shift is aimed at protecting against unauthorized access through stolen credentials and aligns Google with other cloud giants like AWS and Microsoft, which have also moved to enforce MFA. Google says that this requirement addresses heightened security risks in enterprise cloud environments where sensitive data remains a prime target for cyber attacks. But Google's approach to MFA has been, let's say, interesting to date. Jack, what do you think of this story?
Well, I think it's a little late for Google to be waving the MFA flag and say, hey, really need to do this, sometime in the next year, right? We've known for 4 or 5 years now exactly how effective MFA is at preventing identity and credential breaches. And it's just a little late. I think that Google and the rest of the cloud providers should be doing security by default, not security by option. And what I mean by that is when you start and create an account or a service, that service or account should be completely locked down and be as inaccessible and hard to get access to as possible. And it should require your active participation to remove security controls to make it easier to get access to. So I think all accounts should be, and I mentioned this in an earlier story, that MFA should be a mandatory requirement. And if you're not enforcing that, you should find another job. I think Google needs to turn this on immediately and force their customers to take the pain of configuring it for all of their accounts immediately, because it will prevent the pain, much greater pain down the road, from not having MFA and getting your accounts breached and your data stolen. And that's a huge financial and reputational and organizational risk for most organizations. A couple of years ago, AWS went and said all new S3 domains will be by default inaccessible from the internet rather than default accessible. And it's those types of things we need to start enforcing today across our entire cloud footprint to prevent security problems down the road. So I'd really like to see Google get on the bandwagon with everybody else to say security is on by default, and you actually have to actively turn it off in order to make your account less secure. Stephen, we have a very interesting story that Needham suspended its buy rating for Supermicro after the auditor Ernst & Young resigned, citing governance issues and concerns about financial transparency amid an ongoing Department of Justice investigation and Hindenburg Research allegations of accounting manipulation. In response, NVIDIA is redirecting AI server orders to other suppliers to maintain supply chain stability, as Supermicro's stock faces volatility and potential delisting risk. Now, this isn't the first time Supermicro's had problems, is it, Stephen?
Yeah, and that's an interesting aspect here. This Supermicro has long been held up by analysts as an example of a company that had an accounting scandal and was able to come back from that and return to public listing and return pretty much to business as usual. But here we are again, and it's a very interesting and kind of a confusing story. So just to sum up, essentially, the auditors for Supermicro, which is a very respected company, Ernst & Young, who you've probably heard, they resigned abruptly with a public statement saying that they didn't have confidence in the data that was being provided by the company's management and therefore couldn't sign on to the financial statements of the company. Now, this is important because public companies are required to have audited financial releases, financial information, and to have an accounting company publicly resign is a huge slap in the face for a company. What happened? Well, we don't actually know. Supermicro hasn't really talked about that, at least as far as I've read into this story, and I'm not a financial expert by any means, but as far as I've read into this, there's no indication of exactly what happened, apart from the fact that probably for a little while here. The auditors have been fighting with Supermicro over the data that they've been working with, and they finally just threw up their hands in disgust and said, well, we can't work with you if you can't answer our questions. Something like that pretty much seems to be what happened. What's going to happen next for Supermicro? Well, the first thing that's happening is that obviously this is affecting the confidence of customers. Because if a company could be, for example, delisted because of failing to file required financial disclosures, or because of, well, let's say scandal, that makes customers a little bit leery of going to them. It also could cause problems with creditors and suppliers who may not want to continue to work with the company. And frankly, it's going to cause a lot of problems internally as employees who probably had nothing to do with this are struggling to figure out how they should respond to it, whether they can continue to work there, what they can say to their customers and partners and suppliers themselves, and how they can deal with this whole situation. It's basically just a giant, well, trouble, a giant bag of trouble for Supermicro and for the industry. So far, what we've seen is that sales seem to have essentially continued, though no new sales are likely to stop, at least for the time being. We're also likely to see some of their competitors, big names that you know of, like Dell, for example, but also names that you may not know of, who are supplying servers, and especially in the AI space, jumping on this as a way to try to win over some of Supermicro's customers. Ultimately, I think the company is going to have to find themselves a way around this and find themselves an audit company, and probably change some internal practices to make sure that the numbers that they're providing to that audit company make sense. And then they're going to have to move forward and try to get themselves back in the good graces of NASDAQ. That last bit actually may be the easiest thing. NASDAQ does provide some grace periods and has some ability for companies to come back after this, as we've seen, let's see, in the past with some company called Supermicro that had a similar issue. So I think that ultimately the answer here is that this is a big scandal for sure, but Supermicro is probably going to be able to come back from it just like they did last time. Now let's turn to a closer look, which is the big story of the week, pretty much for everybody, everywhere around the world. And that is the shocking news that Donald Trump has been reelected as president of the United States. At least that's how it appears this morning. The election was last night, after all, so probably too close to say anything for certain, but it seems pretty likely. Also, it seems pretty likely that the US Senate is going to swing into Republican hands, and there are early indications that the House the House of Representatives may also end up being dominated by the Republicans, at least by a slim margin. If that happens, this could really change a lot of aspects of American life and American policy. Certainly, there are many, many things that we could talk about, but this is the Gestalt IT Rundown. We talk about enterprise technology here, so let's try to focus on that aspect. What are the implications to enterprise technology of another Trump presidency? Well, it's kind of hard to know because Donald Trump and the Republican Party have not actually been all that clear in their policy platform or their initiatives that they would take if they retook the White House. In fact, this has been one of the challenges for the media dealing with Donald Trump generally, because he tends to say a lot of things, and then people try to interpret those things into concrete policy, and then sometimes he'll say something that conflicts with that. And we're going to see that that's the case with a lot of these enterprise tech aspects of policy as well. But let's start off, Jack, just with your impression. If assuming that Trump returns as president and that the Republicans return to control at least of the Senate, if not the House, what does this mean for enterprise technology?
Well, I think for me, the way I look at it is there's sort of two big implications. The first is that Trump is a very big deregulator. And I Can't remember what he did in his first term, but he has publicly stated that in his second term, he wants to eliminate 10 regulations for every new regulation, which really means that it's hard to get new regulations in place that will regulate big tech. And so I think that's going to be one area where there's going to be, there has been over the past 4 years, a big drive for regulation. And think we'll see that tail down. And in fact, we may see some of the regulation pop off. The other area where I think Donald Trump looks at the world a little bit differently than the outgoing administration would be in the area of mergers and acquisitions. And I think there was the current administration was less enthusiastic about M&A activity, and now I think we may see some more big acquisitions, big M&A activity, where it might have in the past been considered anti-competitive or buying your competitors out. We may see that activity more now with Trump in office.
Yeah, those are certainly things I think that we can kind of infer from the general line of statements that he says. But again, that's sort of how we have to approach this, because he's not big on written policy documents and that sort of thing. So what else can we infer? Well, one of the big questions that came up earlier in the show is nuclear energy. So certainly Trump has talked a lot about nuclear energy in the past. And in fact, one of the platform planks from the RNC convention was a commitment to unleash energy production from all sources, including nuclear. But in very typical Trump fashion, when people tried to pin him down on this, specifically some guy named Joe Rogan, who apparently has a podcast, asked Trump about nuclear energy, and Trump's response was actually not all that positive on it. In fact, he immediately jumped to the fact that nuclear energy is complex and expensive and dangerous, essentially undermining the platform plank of the Republican Party to some extent. But interestingly, he did mention small modular reactors in that answer, which means that clearly internally they've been talking about this whole idea about building small modular nuclear reactors that are deployed at individual factories or data centers. That's been one of the topics that has been brought up by many of the hyperscalers as a way to power their AI infrastructure, as opposed to, for example, locating it next to an existing nuclear power plant or even building a new big nuclear power plant. The problem with SMR is, number one, they don't exist. This is a technology that is more theoretical than realistic. Also, the ones that have been planned don't look all that cost competitive. And in fact, ultimately, I think that companies may turn away from the whole SMR idea based solely on finance. But that being said, Trump does seem to have a pro-nuclear stance generally, if he seems to be pretty concerned about the safety overall. The other aspect that's interesting to me is AI. Now, there was an interesting report last week which showed that AI is really not a consideration for most of the folks in Trump's coalition. If you talk to people about concerns about AI safety and privacy and implications for democracy and things like that, well, that tends to be, in the US at least, a very left-wing issue. And if you talk about those, if you bring those up in polling of Trump voters, they tend to dismiss that entire line of questioning outright. They're not all that worried about AI. They're not all that interested in AI. And I found it really remarkable that that wasn't a topic that came up at all in the election this year. At least wasn't a major topic if it came up at all. So I think what we're going to see is probably a much more laissez-faire attitude toward AI and regulations around privacy of data and the use of AI to displace jobs and so on. That's also probably the case when you look at the people who are advising Trump. I mean, his new BFF, Elon Musk, is building one of the largest AI supercomputers in the world, as we've talked about here on the Rundown. Elon is certainly not going to try to talk Trump into regulating AI. The same is true of some of the other financiers and Silicon Valley VCs that have rallied behind Trump's plans. And if you look at their belief system in terms of where they believe the world and society needs to go in this sort of transhumanist direction, most of them believe that AI is part of the inevitable process of technology. So I suspect that Trump probably doesn't know a lot about AI. This is a guy, remember, who doesn't even use a computer. But it is likely that all the people around him are talking about it pretty favorably. And that's likely to mean a lot less regulation and a lot more investment in AI. I guess the other thing that we could think about too is what about the rest of the world of tech? Jack, what do you think about how this all, what does this all mean for big tech investments?
Well, I think, the where the investments go may change over the next couple of years. I would not be surprised if the Trump administration starts investing more in military technology and military capabilities. And so I think defense or defense related technology will start to see an interest and an increased investment. And I think you might also see some interesting collaboration with the Israeli tech VC environment, given Trump's support of Israel and the Israeli environment as well. And that, I think, will sort of take us down an interesting road. There's a tremendous amount of investment already, but a lot more to do in the cybersecurity domain. I think Trump, having had 8 years of experience, and there was a recent report of China hacking the AT&T and Verizon backdoor wiretapping capabilities to get access to Trump and other political leaders' cell phones, is making them more and more aware. And Trump's obviously had previous cyber attacks against his environment, his organization and environment. So I think the the cybersecurity investment will probably go up a little bit. We may see less investment in some of the other areas. Probably the only other interesting from a true Trump perspective is what happens with True Social versus X, formerly Twitter, now that, as you said, Trump and Elon Musk are BFFs.
Yeah, that's a good question indeed. And I think that it's the areas that you mentioned are definitely things that we can infer, again, based on the people that are advising him, the people that are around him, what they're likely to be talking about. I think the Israeli connection is really interesting, as is his outspoken and aggressive support for the military in Israel. I think that seems very likely that would be a major focus for his administration. Another thing I want to bring up is another topic that we've had here on the rundown quite a lot, and that's the CHIPS Act. Now, this one is very, very fraught. So if you remember, this was the US government investing big, big money to bring semiconductor production into the United States. A lot of this money has gone to Intel, but it's also gone to companies like TSMC and Samsung and others in the space. In fact, pretty much everybody has had their hands out for some of this CHIPS Act funding, and most companies have gotten some. One of the interesting aspects of the CHIPS Act, though, is that it is fairly short term as government programs go. And it's also one of those things where the administration has the ability to disrupt a lot of that funding. And many in the Trump administration have said things that make it sound like, or the would-be Trump administration, have said things that make it sound like they would derail the CHIPS Act. In fact, we've seen some of the folks like, if I remember correctly, J.D. Vance saying that CHIPS Act is not something that they would support, that they don't consider increasing that funding. But at the same time, it's been interesting to see the pushback on that, especially considering that it would impact a huge amount of blue-collar jobs, which are sort of Trump's core constituency, as well as a lot of red states where these investments are being made. And so I would not be surprised at all if basically the naysayers on the CHIPS Act have their way and Trump comes out opposed to it. I also wouldn't be surprised if he decides that he wants to continue it as a way to shore up his base of voters. So I think it's probably too soon to guess what's going to come with the CHIPS Act. Another aspect as well that, Jack, you and I have talked about is communications and telecom. Elon Musk, of course, is big in electric vehicles, which is something that Trump has, I guess, warmed to, but certainly has not been something that he's supportive of, especially not electric boats and sharks. But he also, of course, has a big investment in space, and Trump loves big, important, impressive demonstrations of technology. He reportedly was highly, highly praising Elon Musk's recent success at SpaceX with the Starship booster catch. And I think that it is extremely likely that Trump's administration would direct the FAA and NASA to clear the decks and allow SpaceX to do whatever it wants with Starship. So that's going to be interesting. I wonder what that means for the SLS rocket. If you're into space stuff, that's sort of a cow, a sacred cow that no one can touch because it's built in like 40 different states and it costs way too much. And, I think everybody who looks at it objectively says that it should be canceled. If Elon Musk is as he's alleged to be responsible for cleaning up government waste and inefficiency, I would say the SLS might be at the top of his list to cut. So we'll see about that. And then the other aspect, as you brought up, Jack, earlier, is the SpaceX's other product, which is their satellite communication network. Now, this has been pretty controversial. They have tried to get that access to or get that into broadband funding support and so on. So far, that's been unsuccessful, but we'll see long term, or now that there's a new administration, whether perhaps policies toward StarLink change as well. I guess we've brought up a ton of different things here. Any more that you want to suggest, Jack?
I think that's. I mean, there's so much that we can speculate about, but I think from what are sort of the technology hot buttons and the Trump hot buttons, those are really it. I think that there's been a perception that Elon Musk has been handed some losses from the current administration. In that, as you mentioned, that Starlink, his satellite communication system, was originally involved in the rural broadband program and then was kicked out because they thought it wouldn't deliver, and yet it was the only thing that delivered in my home state in Western North Carolina when it got hit by Hurricane Helene. So I think that there's a good possibility, given again their buddies, that some of those sort of regulatory red tape that exists today will maybe disappear. My hope, and I think that the SLS should disappear. As you mentioned, it's a sacred cow, which also makes for a very tasty hamburger when you get rid of it, when you cook it down to what it really should be. But given how many different states are involved in that and how many different constituencies, that one's really going to be hard to tackle from a regulation, from a get political support to get rid of it type of concern.
Well, we shall see what happens. I, of course, would be remiss if I didn't mention that this new administration is also going to affect lots of other aspects of people's lives. Again, this is our Gestalt IT Rundown show focuses on enterprise tech, and so we had to focus on that here. But of course, there's going to be a lot of concern as well about the many ways that American life are going to be changed by a second Trump administration, and the many ways that this is going to affect people around the world in all sorts of different aspects of their lives. So I don't feel like we're qualified really to weigh in too much on those things. But of course, we're also concerned about anytime there's massive change like this. So we'll see how things shake out. Now let's take a look at the weeks ahead here from Gestalt IT and Tech Field Day. First off, I should point out that we have posted the video from Cloud Field Day 21. If you're interested in that, there was some tremendous presentations there. You'll find those online now. We're also hosting Network Field Day 36 this week. Today and tomorrow is we've got Networking Field Day presentations from companies like Arista, Itential, Meter, Elicity, Viz, and Path Solutions. So tune in for those here on Tech Field Day website, on TechStrong TV, and on LinkedIn. Next week, we're headed to KubeCon in Salt Lake City. We're going to be doing some app dev field day presentations there with companies like Heroku, Southworks, and a brand new company called Kodiak. So check those out, again, live streaming and on our YouTube channel. Then we've got a mobility field day event coming up. We've got another AI field day event coming up in January, and on in 2025. So tune in for those, and we'll see you there. Thanks for watching the Gestalt IT Rundown. You can catch new episodes every Wednesday as a YouTube video on your favorite podcast application, or the Rundown is also streamed on TechStrong TV, and you can catch us on other TechStrong and Futurum Group programs. We'll be back next Wednesday to talk about all of the IT news in the week that was. For now, for myself, Tom Hollingsworth, Jack Poller, and all of us here in the Gestalt IT family, here's wishing you and yours a stress-free and nacho cheesy day.